The supply sergeant looked at her like she was invisible, just another temp worker sorting through endless piles of military uniforms in the depot's suffocating heat. Jessica Martinez kept her head down, methodically creasing sleeves and checking. For tears, her calloused hands moving with a precision that would have surprised anyone paying attention. But nobody was. To them, she was just cheap labor, a civilian contractor filling the gaps where real soldiers couldn't be bothered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They had no idea that the small patch hidden beneath her collar told a story that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman folding their uniforms. When Colonel Rachel Stone walked into that supply depot on a routine inspection, she almost missed it too. Almost. But 20 years in special operations had taught her to notice details others overlooked, and what she saw made her blood run cold with recognition. The North Carolina humidity clung to everything like a wet blanket, even at 7 in the morning. Fort Riverside sprawled across 3,000 acres of pine forest and red clay, its concrete buildings and razor wire perimeter, creating sharp angles against the natural curves of Spanish moss and magnolia trees. The base hummed with constant activity, helicopters thundering overhead on training runs, while the distant crack of rifle fire echoed from the ranges. This was a working installation, not some ceremonial showcase, and everyone from the newest recruit to the base commander knew it. Jessica Martinez walked through the main gate with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it really mattered. Her civilian clothes hung loose and practical, khaki pants and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better years. The security guard barely glanced at her temporary contractor badge, already focused on the convoy of military vehicles queued behind her. She wasn't offended by the lack of attention. In her current situation, invisibility was exactly what she needed. The supply depot sat in the industrial heart of the base, a long rectangular building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed function was the only form that mattered. Loading docks lined one side where trucks delivered everything from boots to body armor, while the other side housed the processing center where uniforms came to be cleaned, repaired, and redistributed. The building's interior was a maze of metal shelving and sorting tables, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly yellow and tired. Jessica pushed through the heavy double doors and immediately felt the familiar weight of institutional air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the southern heat. The scent hit her first, a combination of industrial starch, fabric softener, and the faint chemical smell of cleaning solvents. It was different from the smells she remembered from her other life, but it still carried that unmistakable military efficiency that tried to make order out of chaos. Sergeant Mike Thompson looked up from his clipboard as she approached the supervisor's desk. He was the kind of NCO who had found his niche in logistics and intended to stay there until retirement. A thick-set man in his 40s whose most dangerous mission was probably arguing with vendors about delivery schedules. His assistant, Corporal Danny Walsh, sat nearby scrolling through his phone with the practiced disinterest of someone counting down the hours until his shift ended. "You the new temp?" Thompson asked, his tone carrying that special blend of resignation and mild irritation that came with managing civilian contractors. Jessica nodded and handed him the paperwork from the agency. He scanned it quickly, probably looking for her hourly rate more than her qualifications. "Says here you've got some military experience," he noted, though his voice suggested he didn't think much of whatever that experience might have been. Administration? Communications, maybe? "Some," Jessica replied, keeping her answer short. The paperwork showed her as a veteran, but the specific details of her service were buried in classifications that required clearances Thompson would never possess. As far as he knew, she was just another ex-military person taking whatever work she could find in the civilian world. Thompson gestured toward the far end of the building where pallets of uniforms awaited processing. "We're behind on the cleaning. Rotation. Everything over there needs to be sorted, inspected for damage, and refolded for distribution. It's not complicated work, but it needs to be done right. These uniforms represent this base, and we maintain standards even in the supply." Depot. Jessica followed his pointing finger to where dozens of green canvas bags sat stacked like sleeping giants. Each bag contained uniforms that had come back from the cleaning service, needing to be processed before they could be returned to their owners or sent to new assignments. It was the kind of repetitive, detail-oriented work that would drive most people to distraction. But Jessica found something oddly comforting about the prospect of losing herself in simple, methodical tasks. "Pay attention to the insignia," Corporal Walsh added without looking up from his phone. "Officers get touchy if their rank isn't perfect, and some of these special operations, guys have patches that cost more than your car. Treat everything like it belongs to a general, even if it's just some private's spare uniform." Jessica walked to the first pallet and began her work. She pulled uniforms from the bags one by one, shaking them out and examining them with the systematic thoroughness that had been drilled into her through years of training. Each uniform told a story through its wear patterns and modifications. Combat uniforms showed different stress points than dress uniforms. Uniforms that had seen deployment carried subtle signs that desk warriors' uniforms never developed. Her hands moved with unconscious efficiency, creating precise creases and checking every seam for damage. The muscle memory was still there, ingrained so deeply that she could probably fold uniforms in her sleep. As she worked, the familiar rhythm began to settle her mind, pushing away the constant background noise of hypervigilance that had followed her home from places whose names she couldn't mention to civilians. The other workers in the depot went about their business with the casual efficiency of people who had done the same jobs for months or years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Forklifts moved pallets of supplies while clerks updated inventory databases and processed requisition forms. The steady hum of activity created a white noise that should have been soothing, but Jessica found herself automatically cataloging every sound, every movement, every person who entered or left the building. Old habits died hard, especially when they had kept you alive in places where letting your guard down meant not coming home. Private Amy Chun was restocking cleaning supplies nearby when she first noticed something different about the new temp worker. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way the woman moved with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture had a purpose. Most civilian contractors carried themselves with the slightly lost air of people adapting to military protocols they didn't fully understand. This woman seemed to understand the protocols perfectly. She just wasn't advertising the fact. "How long you been doing this kind of work?" Amy asked during a lull in her restocking, curious about the woman who could fold uniforms faster than anyone she'd ever seen. Jessica looked up from the combat uniform she was inspecting, noting the particular wear pattern around the knee pads that suggested its owner spent significant time in prone positions. "A while," she said simply. "It's honest work." Amy nodded, though something in the woman's tone made her think there was more to the story. The way she handled the uniforms wasn't casual or careless like most temp workers. Her fingers automatically checked all the right places for damage, and she seemed to understand the significance of different patches and insignia without having to ask questions. When she came across a uniform with Ranger tabs, she handled it with the kind of respect that suggested personal familiarity with what those tabs represented. The morning wore on with steady progress through the backlog of uniforms. Jessica fell into a meditative rhythm, each fold and crease a small act of precision in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. This was work she could control. Work where the standards were clear and the results were measurable. There was something therapeutic about taking something wrinkled and disheveled and returning it to proper military specification. Around mid-morning, she came across a uniform. That made her pause. The fabric was slightly different from the standard issue, with reinforcement patterns that suggested it was designed for specialized use. The patches had been removed for cleaning, but she could see the slight discoloration where they had been. Attached, ghost images of insignia that told a story to anyone who knew how to read them. The wear pattern spoke of someone who had carried heavy equipment over difficult terrain, who had operated in environments where regular uniforms wouldn't suffice. Jessica's hands stilled for a moment as memories threatened to surface, images of her own specialized gear and the teammates who had worn similar uniforms in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. She took a slow breath and forced herself to continue working, folding the uniform with the same care she gave to all the others, but unable to shake the feeling that it belonged to someone who shared more than just a size designation with her. Sergeant Thompson made his rounds periodically, checking on progress and making notes on his ever-present clipboard. He seemed satisfied with Jessica's work rate and attention to detail, though he showed no particular interest in engaging her in conversation beyond basic instructions. She was just another temporary contractor to him, someone who would finish her assignment and disappear back into the civilian world without leaving much of an impression. "You're moving through this faster than most," he commented during one of his visits, surveying the neat stacks of processed uniforms. "Most TON take twice as long and half the uniforms need to be redone. You sure you haven't done this before?" Jessica continued folding without breaking rhythm. "I've always been good with my hands," she said, which was true enough without being specific about what those hands had been trained to do. Thompson nodded and moved on, apparently satisfied with the explanation. The lunch hour brought a temporary lull in activity as most of the depot personnel headed to the base cafeteria. Jessica remained at her station, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home while continuing to work through the uniforms. She preferred to avoid the crowded dining facility with its noise and unpredictable social dynamics. The quiet of the depot during lunch break was more conducive to the kind of mental space she needed to maintain. It was during this quiet period that she found the uniform that would change everything. At first glance, it looked like any other combat uniform, the same digital camouflage pattern and basic construction as dozens of others she had processed that morning. But as she shook it out and began her standard inspection, her fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden inside the collar, where it would be invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look, was a small patch that had somehow survived the cleaning process. It was no bigger than a quarter, made of subdued fabric that would blend seamlessly with the uniform's coloration. But Jessica recognized it immediately, and the recognition hit her like a physical blow. The patch showed a trident surrounded by crossed arrows, executed in thread so fine it was barely visible unless you held it at exactly the right angle. Below the main design, in lettering so small it required squinting to read, were the words. That confirmed what the symbol had already told her. DevGru Team 6, Direct Action. Jessica's hands began to shake slightly as she stared at the patch. DevGru was the Navy's development group, the most classified unit within the already secretive SEAL teams. It was a designation that officially didn't exist, operated by people whose names appeared on no public rosters and whose missions were denied by 3 different government agencies. The patch in her hands represented the absolute pinnacle of special operations capability, worn only by operators who had been selected from the already elite SEAL community for work that couldn't be acknowledged. She knew because she had worn an identical patch for 3 years, in places where the difference between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds and inches. The muscle memory of that patch against her skin was as real as the scars she still carried from her last mission. The one that had ended her career and sent her teammates home in boxes that couldn't be opened at their funerals. Jessica carefully reattached the patch to its hidden position inside the collar and continued folding the uniform. But her mind was no longer focused on the task at hand. The uniform belonged to someone who shared her background, someone who had walked the same dark paths and carried the same weight of operations that couldn't be discussed at family dinners or high school reunions. In this building full of regular military personnel going about their routine duties, there was someone else who knew what it felt like to operate in the shadows. The afternoon brought increased activity as the depot prepared for the evening shift change. More personnel moved through the building, picking up supplies and processing paperwork. Jessica continued her methodical work through the remaining uniforms, but part of her attention was now focused on trying to identify who might be the owner of that particular piece of clothing. Private Chun returned from lunch with renewed curiosity about the temp worker who seemed to know more about military protocols than most permanent party soldiers. She positioned herself where she could observe Jessica's work methods while appearing to focus on her own duties. There was something about the woman's precision and attention to detail that went beyond simple competence. The way she handled certain uniforms suggested familiarity with gear and equipment that most civilians would never encounter. "Ma'am," Amy finally worked up the courage to ask, "where did you serve before this? You handle these uniforms like you know exactly what they're for." Jessica looked up from the uniform she was processing, a standard issue garrison uniform that belonged to someone who probably spent most of their time in offices rather than field operations. "I was in the Navy for a while," she said, which was true without being complete. "Different kind of work than this, but you learn to pay attention to details." Amy nodded, sensing that there was more to the story, but also understanding that some veterans didn't like to talk about their service. She had learned to recognize the signs of people who had seen combat, the subtle markers that distinguished them from those who had served in safer assignments. This woman carried herself with the controlled awareness that Amy had seen in some of the special operations personnel who passed through the base. The day was winding toward its end when Colonel Rachel Stone entered the supply depot for what was supposed to be a routine inspection. She moved through the building with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, her uniform immaculate and her bearing suggesting someone who had earned her rank through competence rather than politics. At 45, she was one of the youngest full colonels in special operations, with a reputation for operational excellence that had been earned in some of the most challenging environments the military had to offer. Stone was conducting a comprehensive review of base logistics operations, part of a larger assessment of support capabilities for the specialized units that used Fort Riverside as a training and staging area. The supply depot was just one stop on a long list of facilities that needed to meet the exacting standards required for special operations support. She spoke briefly with Sergeant Thompson about inventory procedures and turnaround times, reviewing documentation and asking pointed questions about quality control measures. Her inspection was thorough but efficient, the kind of review that left no doubt about her attention to detail while respecting the time constraints of people who had jobs to do. As she moved through the depot, Stone's trained eye automatically cataloged everything from security procedures to personnel deployment. It was during this systematic observation that she noticed the civilian contractor working alone at one of the processing stations. There was something about the woman's posture and movement patterns that caught her attention, a subtle quality that suggested military training even in civilian clothes. Stone approached the workstation where Jessica was finishing her processing of the day's final batch of uniforms. The piles of completed work were impressive both in quantity and quality, with each uniform folded to standards that would have satisfied the most demanding drill instructor. "Afternoon," Stone said, her tone friendly but carrying the unmistakable authority of her rank. "I'm Colonel Stone. I don't think we've met." Jessica looked up from her work, and Stone immediately noticed the woman's eyes. They held the kind of situational awareness that came from experience in environments where complacency could be fatal. This wasn't some temporary worker killing time between real jobs. This was someone with serious training trying to blend into a routine assignment. "Jessica Martinez," she replied, standing with a posture that was respectfully military without being obvious about it. "I'm with the temporary staffing agency, working on the uniform backlog." Stone nodded, but her attention was already focused on details that others had missed. The woman's hands showed the kind of callousing that came from handling weapons and equipment rather than office work. Her stance was balanced and alert, and she had positioned herself where she could see both entrances to the work area without appearing to be watching them. "How are you finding the work?" Stone asked, genuinely curious about what had brought someone with obvious military experience to a temporary contract position in a supply depot. "It's good work," Jessica replied, honest and straightforward. "Everyone's been professional." As Stone prepared to continue her inspection, she noticed something that made her pause. Jessica had been working on a combat uniform, and as she moved to place it on the completed pile, the collar shifted slightly. For just a moment, Stone caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. The edge of a patch barely visible but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Stone had seen that particular patch before, though not often and never in places where it could be officially acknowledged. It was the kind of insignia that existed only in the most classified corners of military operations, worn by people whose existence was denied by the government they served. Stone's expression didn't change, but internally every instinct developed through 20 years of special operations experience was telling her that the woman standing in front of her was not who she appeared to be. The patch belonged to someone with clearances that exceeded most general officers, someone who had operated at levels of classification that had no official designation. "That's a nice piece of work," Stone said casually, gesturing toward the uniform Jessica had been folding. "Whoever owns that has some interesting patches." Jessica's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Stone had spent her career reading subtle signals and micro-expressions, and that tiny hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "Just standard issue gear," Jessica replied, but her voice carried a careful neutrality that confirmed Stone's suspicions. The two women looked at each other across the workstation, both understanding that a moment of recognition had just occurred. Stone realized she was looking at someone whose service record was probably buried so deep in classified archives that it might as well not exist. Jessica understood that her carefully maintained cover had just been blown by someone with the experience to recognize signs that others had missed completely. Colonel Stone glanced around the depot, noting the various personnel going about their duties without any awareness of what was happening at the uniform processing station. This wasn't the place for the conversation that needed to happen, but it was a conversation that definitely needed to happen. "Ms. Martinez," she said quietly, "I think we should talk." Colonel Stone's invitation hung in the air between them like a challenge neither woman could ignore. Jessica felt the familiar tension that came with exposure, the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive in places where a single mistake meant never coming home. But this wasn't a hostile interrogation in some foreign compound. This was a supply depot in North Carolina where the worst thing that should happen was a paper cut from a shipping invoice. The afternoon sun slanted through the depot's high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor as the building settled into its late-day rhythm. Most of the morning shift personnel had already departed, leaving behind the skeleton crew that would handle evening operations. The constant hum of air conditioning mixed with the distant sounds of base activity, helicopters conducting training runs, and the methodical cadence of drill instructors working with new recruits somewhere beyond the chain-link perimeter. Jessica finished folding the uniform with the classified patch, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. 20 years of operational security training didn't disappear. just because she was wearing civilian clothes and processing military laundry. Every instinct told her to deflect, to maintain her cover, to give Colonel Stone nothing more than the bland responses she'd been providing all day. But there was something in the Colonel's bearing that suggested deflection wouldn't work. This wasn't some supply officer looking to fill time with casual conversation. Stone moved with the controlled awareness of someone who had operated in environments where reading people correctly was a matter of survival, where the ability to distinguish between genuine civilians and threats, wearing civilian clothes, could determine mission success or catastrophic failure. Stone gestured toward the administrative office at the far end of the depot, a small space with glass walls that would provide privacy while maintaining visual contact with the main work area. "Would you mind stepping into the office for a moment? I have some questions about processing procedures that might be easier to discuss away from all this noise." It was phrased as a request, but Jessica understood it was really a politely worded order. She could refuse, of course. As a civilian contractor, she had every right to decline additional duties beyond her stated assignment. But refusing would only confirm Stone's suspicions and potentially create complications that could ripple far beyond this temporary job. Jessica nodded and followed Stone toward the office, acutely aware of how the Colonel positioned herself to maintain situational awareness while appearing completely casual about the movement. It was a professional courtesy between operators, the kind of spatial awareness that became second nature to people who had learned to think tactically, even in supposedly safe environments. The office was exactly what she'd expected from a military supply depot. Functional furniture that prioritized durability over comfort, filing cabinets secured with combination locks, and walls covered with charts tracking everything from inventory levels to maintenance schedules. A computer terminal displayed logistics, software that could probably account for every button and shoelace on the entire base. It was the kind of space where efficiency was measured in numbers and success was defined by keeping complex supply chains moving smoothly. Stone closed the door behind them and gestured for Jessica to take a seat in one of the metal chairs facing the desk. Instead of sitting behind the desk in the traditional power position, Stone chose the chair beside Jessica's, creating a more collaborative atmosphere despite the obvious difference in their current status. "Ms. Martinez," Stone began, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that came from years of dealing with personnel issues. "I've been conducting logistics assessments all week, and I have to say, your work quality is exceptional. Sergeant Thompson mentioned you're processing uniforms faster than anyone they've had in this position, and the attention to detail is remarkable." Jessica waited for the other shoe to drop. In her experience, conversations that began with compliments rarely stayed that way, especially when they were initiated by senior officers who had noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. "I appreciate that," Jessica replied carefully. "I've always believed in doing whatever job I'm assigned to the best of my ability." Stone nodded, studying Jessica's face with the kind of attention that suggested she was reading far more than just words. "That's an admirable philosophy. It's also one that I've noticed tends to be especially common among people with certain types of military backgrounds. People who were trained to maintain standards regardless of the mission's apparent importance." The statement hung between them, neither quite an accusation nor a simple observation. Jessica recognized the technique from her own training in human intelligence gathering. Stone was providing an opening for voluntary disclosure while making it clear that she already suspected far more than she was saying directly. "I served in the Navy for several years," Jessica said, sticking to the minimal truth that was already established in her employment records. "I suppose some habits stick with you longer than others." Stone leaned back slightly in her chair, a gesture that managed to be both relaxed and alert simultaneously. "The Navy's a big organization. Lots of different specialties, different kinds of training, some more specialized than others." Jessica felt the conversation circling closer to territory she couldn't discuss. Not without clearances and need-to-know authorizations that didn't exist in supply depot offices. The patch Stone had glimpsed represented operations that were compartmentalized beyond the reach of normal military channels, missions that were planned in facilities that didn't appear on organizational charts, and executed by people whose names were redacted from after-action reports. "I did my job like everyone else," Jessica said, keeping her tone neutral. "Served my time, got my discharge, moved on to civilian life." Stone smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested she understood exactly what wasn't being said. "Of course. And now you're working temporary contracts while you figure out what comes next." That's a common enough story among veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The words were understanding, but Jessica caught the subtle emphasis on temporary that suggested Stone was questioning why someone with obvious capabilities was settling for entry-level contract work. It was a fair question, one that Jessica had been asking herself every morning when she woke up in the kind of cheap motel room where the previous night's occupants left ghosts in the cigarette-stained curtains. "The job market can be challenging for veterans," Jessica said, which was true enough. What she didn't mention was that the job market was especially challenging for veterans whose skill sets were classified at levels that prevented them from appearing on resumes, whose references worked for agencies that officially didn't exist, and whose most relevant experience couldn't be discussed with potential employers who lacked the necessary security clearances. Stone nodded thoughtfully, as if she was considering the challenges facing transitioning veterans. But Jessica could see something else in the colonel's expression, a recognition that went beyond sympathy for general employment difficulties. "I imagine it's particularly challenging when your experience is in areas that don't translate easily to civilian applications," Stone said carefully. "Specialized skills that might be highly valued in certain contexts, but difficult to explain in a standard job interview." Jessica felt her pulse quicken slightly. Stone was walking right up to the edge of classified territory, approaching the kind of conversation that could only happen between people with appropriate clearances and legitimate need to know. The problem was that Jessica's current status as a civilian contractor didn't provide either of those things, regardless of what clearances she might have held in the past. Every veteran has to find their own way to adapt their military experience to civilian opportunities, Jessica replied, falling back on the kind of generic response that revealed nothing while acknowledging the general challenge. Stone was quiet for a moment, and Jessica could almost see her weighing options and considering approaches. This was someone with significant command experience making decisions about how to proceed with incomplete information, balancing curiosity against security, protocols and personal interest against official responsibilities. "Ms. Martinez," Stone finally said, her tone shifting to something more direct, "I'm going to be honest with you. I've spent most of my career in special operations, and I've learned to recognize certain indicators that suggest someone has background in similar areas. The way you carry yourself, your situational awareness, your attention to detail, even the way you fold uniforms suggests training that goes well beyond standard military service." Jessica felt the walls closing in, not in a threatening way, but in the inexorable manner of someone who had been professionally trained to extract information, recognizing someone who had been professionally trained to protect it. This was the kind of conversation that could only end one of two ways, with complete honesty or with the kind of carefully constructed deflection that would probably satisfy Stone's curiosity while maintaining operational security. "I appreciate your confidence in my abilities," Jessica said, choosing her words carefully, "but I think you might be reading more into basic professionalism than is really there." Stone's smile suggested she wasn't buying the deflection, but she also wasn't pushing harder immediately. Instead, she shifted tactics in a way that caught Jessica completely off guard. "Tell me about your teammates," Stone said quietly. The Words hit Jessica like a physical blow, striking directly at the emotional core she'd been working so hard to protect. Stone couldn't have known about the photograph in Jessica's bag, couldn't have known about the promises made to dying friends, or the guilt that followed her through restless nights in anonymous motel rooms. But somehow, she'd found the exact pressure point that would cut through all the professional deflection and operational security training. Jessica's carefully maintained composure wavered for just a moment, long enough for Stone to see the pain that lived behind her controlled exterior. It was the kind of recognition that passed between people who had both lost friends in places where their sacrifices couldn't be publicly acknowledged, where their families received folded flags and carefully worded letters that revealed nothing about how or why their loved ones had died. "I'm sorry," Stone said, and the apology carried genuine understanding. "I didn't mean to push into painful territory. But I've seen that look before, in people who've carried certain kinds of weight. People who've lost teammates in operations that can't be discussed at funerals." Jessica took a slow breath, fighting to regain the emotional equilibrium that had been her armor through months of civilian employment and casual interactions with people who had no idea what she'd seen or done. The problem with meeting someone who understood the weight you carried was that it became harder to pretend the weight didn't exist. "Everyone loses people," Jessica said finally. "That's not unique to any particular kind of service." Stone nodded, accepting the deflection while making it clear she understood its limitations. "You're absolutely right. Loss is universal. But there are different kinds of loss, and some carry different kinds of weight. Some losses can't be honored publicly, can't be discussed with family members, can't even be fully acknowledged by the people who authorized the missions that led to them." Jessica felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the emotional walls she'd built to contain grief that had nowhere to go and anger that had no legitimate target. Stone was describing exactly the kind of loss that had ended Jessica's career and sent her into the civilian world with skills she couldn't use and experience she couldn't discuss. "Colonel," Jessica said, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining control, "I'm not sure what you think you know about my background, but I'm just a temporary contractor trying to do an honest job. Whatever you think you see, whatever you think you recognize, I'm not that person anymore." Stone leaned forward slightly, her expression showing the kind of understanding that came from personal experience with the aftermath of classified operations. "Ms. Martinez, I'm not trying to compromise your security or put you in an uncomfortable position, but I've spent enough time in the special operations community to recognize when I'm talking to someone who's been there, really been there." Jessica met Stone's gaze directly, seeing in the colonel's eyes the same shadows that looked back at her from motel bathroom mirrors. This was someone who understood that certain kinds of service left permanent marks, who knew that some experiences changed you in ways that civilian life couldn't heal or normal career paths couldn't accommodate. "Even if that were true," Jessica said carefully, "it wouldn't change my current situation. I'm here doing a job, earning a paycheck, trying to figure out what comes next. My past doesn't have any bearing on folding uniforms in a supply depot." Stone was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, less interrogative and more collaborative. "You know, we have ongoing challenges with logistics support for certain specialized units that train here. Units that require support personnel with experience in handling sensitive equipment and understanding security protocols that go beyond standard military procedures." Jessica recognized the opening being offered, an opportunity disguised as casual conversation about staffing challenges. Stone was suggesting possibilities without making specific offers, creating space for Jessica to express interest without compromising whatever cover story she needed to maintain. "That sounds like it would require people with appropriate clearances and background investigations," Jessica replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit suggestion. "It would," Stone agreed. But sometimes the hardest part isn't finding people with the right clearances. It's finding people with the right experience and temperament. People who understand that some work requires absolute discretion and complete reliability. Jessica felt a familiar pull, the attraction of meaningful work that would use her skills and experience instead of hiding them. But she also felt the weight of everything that had driven her away from that world, the losses and compromises and moral complexities that came with operating in the shadows. "Colonel, I appreciate whatever opportunity you might be suggesting, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility again." Stone nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen talented people struggle with the transition between operational and civilian worlds. "I understand completely, but sometimes readiness isn't about feeling prepared. Sometimes it's about recognizing when staying on the sidelines becomes more painful than getting back in the game." Jessica felt the truth of that statement settle into the spaces between her ribs, where the constant ache of unused skills and unfulfilled purpose had taken up permanent residence. Stone was right that civilian life hadn't healed the wounds left by her last mission, had only given her different ways to avoid confronting them. What exactly would this theoretical position involve? Jessica asked, surprised to hear herself engaging with the possibility. Stone's expression showed satisfaction at the question, but she was careful not to push too hard or move too fast. Support coordination for training exercises involving visiting units, equipment management, security oversight, liaison work with personnel who have specialized requirements. Nothing operational, nothing that would put you back in harm's way, but work that would actually use your capabilities. Jessica considered the offer, weighing the appeal of meaningful employment against the risks of re-entering a world she'd left for very specific reasons. The possibility of working with people who understood her background was appealing, but it also meant the possibility of new losses, new compromises, new reasons to wake up in the middle of the night wondering if she'd made the right choices. "I'd need to think about it," Jessica said finally. Stone nodded and reached into her uniform pocket, withdrawing a business card with minimal information. "My direct number is on there. If you decide you're interested, call me. If you decide you're not, that's fine too. Either way, this conversation stays between us." Jessica accepted the card, noting that it contained only Stone's name, rank, and a phone number with no unit designation or official address. It was the kind of card that people in certain lines of work carried when they needed to be contactable, but couldn't advertise their actual responsibilities. "Thank you for considering me," Jessica said, meaning it despite her uncertainty about the offer. Stone stood, extending her hand for a professional handshake. "Thank you for your service, Ms. Martinez, however and wherever that service was performed." Jessica shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who had earned her rank through competence rather than politics. There was something reassuring about Stone's direct approach, her willingness to acknowledge realities that couldn't be discussed openly while respecting the boundaries that had to be maintained. As they prepared to leave the office, Stone paused. "At the door, one more thing. The patch you found today, the one inside that uniform collar. I'd appreciate it if that stayed between us as well. The person who owns that uniform has earned the right to maintain whatever operational security he feels is necessary." Jessica nodded, understanding that Stone was confirming what she'd already suspected about the patch's significance. It also confirmed that Stone knew exactly what the patch represented and was testing Jessica's discretion as much as her capabilities. "Of course," Jessica replied. "I didn't see anything that wasn't supposed to be there." Stone's smile showed approval for the response. "I thought as much. People with your background understand the importance of protecting others' operational security." They returned to the main depot area where the evening shift was beginning to take over from the day workers. Jessica collected her personal belongings and completed the paperwork documenting her day's work, noting with professional satisfaction that she'd processed more uniforms than any previous contractor according to Sergeant Thompson's records. As she prepared to leave the base, Jessica found herself thinking about Stone's offer and the implications of returning to work that would use her actual skills and experience. The appeal was undeniable, but so were the risks. Getting back into that world meant reopening possibilities for both professional fulfillment and personal loss, for meaningful work and sleepless nights wondering about the consequences of decisions made in classified environments. The evening air was thick with humidity as she walked toward the parking area, where her aging pickup truck waited among the more practical vehicles of military personnel and civilian contractors. The base was settling into its evening rhythm, with different units conducting night training exercises and security personnel beginning their overnight patrols. Jessica climbed into her truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Stone's business card resting on the dashboard where she could see it without having to handle it again. The card represented a choice between the safety of anonymity and the risks of engagement, between the emptiness of underemployment and the complexity of work that would matter. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters conducting night operations, their rotors beating rhythms that still lived in her dreams, both good and bad. The sound reminded her of everything she'd lost and everything she'd left behind, but also of everything she might still be capable of contributing if she found the courage to try again. Starting the truck's engine, Jessica drove toward the base. Exit, passing security checkpoints and razor wire barriers that separated the military world from the civilian community beyond. Behind her, the lights of Fort Riverside continued their steady glow, maintaining readiness for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. As she merged onto the highway leading back to her motel, Jessica caught herself checking her rearview mirror with the automatic vigilance that had never fully disappeared despite months of civilian routine. Some habits died hard, especially the ones that had kept you alive in places where relaxing your guard meant never getting the chance to make that mistake again. The drive back to town gave her time to think about Stone's offer and what accepting it might mean for the carefully constructed civilian life she'd been building. It wasn't much of a life, certainly nothing that resembled the future she'd once imagined for herself, but it was safe and predictable and free from the moral complexities that came with classified work. But safety and predictability had their own costs, she was beginning to realize. The slow erosion of purpose, the constant awareness that she was using only a fraction of her capabilities, the growing certainty that she was hiding from challenges rather than recovering from them. Stone had been right about staying on the sidelines becoming its own form of suffering. By the time she reached her motel, Jessica had made a decision. Not about Stone's offer, which would require more consideration and probably a few sleepless nights of weighing options, but about her own trajectory and what she wanted from whatever came next. She was tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that her skills and experience didn't matter, tired of folding other people's uniforms. While her own gathered dust in a storage unit, she visited only to pay the monthly fees. Whether that meant accepting Stone's offer or finding some other way to engage with meaningful work, she needed to stop hiding from who she was and what she was capable of contributing. The motel room welcomed her with its familiar shabbiness, the kind of temporary accommodation that was designed for people passing through rather than people trying to build anything permanent. But tonight, instead of feeling like a refuge from the complexities of the outside world, it felt like exactly what it was, a place for people who weren't sure where they belonged next. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the photograph she'd been carrying, the one that showed her with teammates who would never grow older than they were in that moment, captured somewhere in the Afghan mountains. Looking at their faces, she tried to imagine what they would tell her about Stone's offer, about the choice between safety and engagement, about the responsibility to use gifts that came at such a high price. She thought they would probably tell her to stop overthinking and start acting, to quit treating her survival as something to be ashamed of and start treating it as something to be honored through continued service. They'd probably remind her that they hadn't died so she could fold uniforms in a supply depot, but so she could continue the work they'd all believed in together. Placing the photograph on the knitstand where she could see it, Jessica reached for Stone's business card and her cell phone. She wasn't ready to make the call tonight, but she was ready to start thinking seriously about what she would say when she did. The call came 3 days later, just as Jessica was finishing her morning shift at a different temporary assignment, this one at a civilian warehouse where she spent 8 hours moving boxes that contained nothing more sensitive than office supplies and cleaning products. The work was mind-numbing in its simplicity, requiring none of the skills that had once defined her professional identity, but it paid enough to cover her basic expenses while she continued to wrestle with Stone's offer. Jessica had been checking her phone obsessively since their conversation, alternating between hoping Stone would call with additional information and dreading the moment when she'd have to make a concrete decision about her future, the business. Card had migrated from her dashboard to her wallet, to her knitstand and back again, a physical reminder of possibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. When her phone finally rang with an unfamiliar number, Jessica felt her pulse quicken with a combination of anticipation and anxiety that reminded her uncomfortably of pre-mission briefings in secured facilities where the consequences of poor decisions were measured in lives rather than job performance evaluations. Ms. Martinez. Stone's voice was crisp and professional, but Jessica detected an undercurrent of urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine follow-up call. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I have a situation that's developed, and I think you might be exactly the person I need to help resolve it. Jessica stepped away from the warehouse loading dock where she'd been cataloging incoming shipments, moving to a quiet corner where she could speak without being overheard by co-workers who had no need to know about her other life or the conversations that connected her to it. What kind of situation? Jessica asked, her professional training automatically kicking in to assess the nature of whatever problem Stone was dealing with. We have a training exercise scheduled for next week involving a visiting unit that has some very specific support requirements, Stone explained, her tone carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was choosing her words for an unsecured phone line. The contractor we'd arranged to handle their logistics coordination has had a family emergency and can't fulfill the commitment. We need someone with appropriate background and clearances who can step in on short notice. Jessica understood immediately that Stone was offering her a trial run, a chance to demonstrate her capabilities in a real-world situation without making a long-term commitment to either side. It was a smart approach that would allow both of them to evaluate whether her skills were still sharp enough for the work and whether she could handle the psychological pressures of re-entering that world. What would the time frame be? Jessica asked, surprised to find herself already thinking tactically about the requirements rather than emotionally about the risks. The unit arrives Monday morning, Stone replied. We'd need you to start Sunday evening for advance preparation. The exercise runs through Friday, so we're talking about a week of intensive coordination work. The compensation would be significantly better than your current assignments, and it would give you a chance to see whether this kind of work still fits. Jessica felt the familiar pull of operational planning, the intellectual challenge of coordinating complex moving parts under time pressure with stakes that mattered. It had been months since she'd been asked to solve problems that required more than basic physical labor and attention to detail. Months since anyone had trusted her with responsibilities that could impact mission success or failure. What's the nature of the unit? Jessica asked, knowing that Stone would provide only the information she needed to make an informed decision. Counter-terrorism specialists conducting advanced urban warfare training, Stone replied. They'll be working with explosive ordnance, communications equipment, and weapon systems that require someone familiar with special operations protocols to manage the logistics chain. Someone who understands that certain equipment doesn't get logged in standard inventory systems. Jessica nodded even though Stone couldn't see her, understanding the implications of working with gear that existed outside normal supply channels. It was the kind of work that required absolute discretion and complete reliability, where a single mistake in equipment handling could compromise not just the training exercise but potentially ongoing operations that couldn't be discussed in official reports. "I'd need to think about it," Jessica said, though she could already feel herself leaning toward acceptance. The intellectual challenge alone was appealing after months of work that engaged none of her actual capabilities, but there was also something deeper pulling her toward the opportunity. A sense that maybe it was time to stop running from who she was and what she was trained to do. Stone's response suggested she understood the internal conflict Jessica was wrestling with. "I know it's a big decision, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you were the right person for the job. But Miss Martinez, I've seen what happens to people with your background when they stay away from meaningful work too long. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is get back to doing what you're actually good at." Jessica felt the truth of that. Observation settled into the space between her ribs, where the constant ache of unused potential had taken up permanent residence. Stone was right that civilian life hadn't healed the wounds left by her departure from special operations, had only given her different ways to avoid confronting the fundamental question of what she was supposed to do with skills that couldn't be used in normal employment. "If I agreed to this," Jessica said carefully, "what would be the security requirements? I assume this isn't the kind of work where I could discuss details with anyone outside the program." "Complete operational security," Stone confirmed. "The visiting unit's identity, their training objectives, their equipment requirements, everything about the exercise would be compartmentalized. You'd be read into the program at a level appropriate to your responsibilities, but everything you learned would stay within those boundaries." Jessica appreciated Stone's directness about the security requirements, understanding that re-entering the classified world meant accepting restrictions on what she could discuss with anyone outside. It was a familiar constraint, one that had defined much of her military career, but it also meant stepping back into a world where the psychological isolation that came with keeping secrets was an occupational hazard. "Colonel," Jessica said, "finally, I need to be honest with you. I left this world for specific reasons, and some of those reasons haven't changed. I'm not sure I'm the same person who used to do this kind of work." Stone was quiet for a moment before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried the understanding of someone who had seen talented people struggle with the transition between different phases of their careers. "Ms. Martinez, I've read between the lines of your service record, or at least the parts that aren't redacted beyond recognition. I know you've seen and done things that leave permanent marks, and I know that coming back to this world means confronting some of those experiences again. But I also know that people with your background rarely find lasting satisfaction in work. That doesn't challenge them." Jessica felt Stone's words resonate with her own growing awareness that safety and predictability had their own costs, that hiding from challenges rather than recovering from them was its own form of suffering. The months of civilian employment had given her physical safety and emotional distance from the traumatic experiences that had ended her military career, but they hadn't given her purpose or fulfillment or the sense that her life was moving in a meaningful direction. "What happens if I take the assignment and realize I can't handle it?" Jessica asked, voicing the fear that had been underlying all her hesitation about re-engaging with classified work. "Then you complete the week professionally and we part ways with mutual respect," Stone replied without hesitation. "Ms. Martinez, this isn't about testing whether you're tough enough or committed enough to return to special operations. This is about giving you a chance to see whether meaningful work still feels like something you want in your life." Jessica appreciated the lack of pressure in Stone's approach, the recognition that her decision needed to be based on her own assessment of her capabilities and desires, rather than external expectations about what she should be willing to do. It was a level of respect for her autonomy that had been absent from much of her military experience, where mission requirements often took precedence over individual preferences or concerns. "I'll do it," Jessica said, surprised to hear the words come out of her mouth before she'd consciously made the decision. But somehow, speaking the commitment aloud felt right in a way that months of deliberation hadn't achieved. "Outstanding," Stone replied, and Jessica could hear genuine satisfaction in her voice. "I'll have someone from my office contact you this afternoon with the preliminary briefing materials and logistical details. Plan to be on base Sunday at 1800 hours for your initial read-in and equipment orientation." Jessica felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety begin building in her chest. The pre-mission nervous energy that she remembered from countless operations where the success of complex endeavors depended on everyone involved executing their responsibilities flawlessly. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, and she was surprised to discover that she'd missed it. "Colonel," Jessica said before Stone could end the call, "thank you for giving me this opportunity. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Stone replied with confidence that Jessica hoped was justified. "Welcome back to the team, Ms. Martinez." The call ended, leaving Jessica standing in the warehouse parking lot with the sudden realization that she'd just committed to returning to a world she'd spent months trying to leave behind. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, a step toward either redemption or disaster that wouldn't be determined until she actually had to perform under pressure again. Jessica returned to her shift at the warehouse, but her mind was no longer focused on inventory management and shipping schedules. Instead, she found herself automatically running through mental checklists of the kind of preparation she'd need for coordinating special operations logistics, thinking about security protocols and equipment handling procedures that she hadn't used since her discharge. The muscle memory was still there, she realized with some surprise. The systematic approach to complex problems, the ability to think several steps ahead while maintaining awareness of current requirements, the instinctive understanding of how small details could impact large outcomes. Stone had been right that people with her background rarely found lasting satisfaction in work that didn't challenge them, because the capabilities developed through years of high-stakes training didn't simply disappear when they were no longer being used. That afternoon, as promised, Jessica received a call from someone identifying himself as Master Sergeant Rodriguez from Colonel Stone's office. His voice carried the professional courtesy of someone accustomed to dealing with personnel who possessed clearances and capabilities that couldn't be discussed openly, but who needed to be briefed on operational requirements without compromising security protocols. "Ms. Martinez," Rodriguez began, "I understand you'll be joining us for next week's training coordination. I have some preliminary materials that I'll need to deliver to you in person, along with some administrative details we'll need to complete before Sunday evening." Jessica understood that her personal delivery requirement meant the materials were classified at a level that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels, requiring face-to-face transfer with appropriate security measures. It was a reminder that accepting Stone's offer meant re-entering a world where even routine administrative tasks were governed by security protocols that most people never encountered. "When would be convenient for that meeting?" Jessica asked, already thinking about her schedule and the preparation she'd need to make before beginning the assignment. "This evening would be ideal, if that works for you," Rodriguez replied. "There's a coffee shop called Murphy's about 2 miles south of the base main gate. Would 1900 hours be acceptable?" Jessica agreed to the meeting time and location, understanding that the choice of venue was deliberate. Murphy's was the kind of establishment frequented by military personnel and defense contractors, A place where two people discussing work-related matters wouldn't attract attention or curiosity from civilians, who might ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of their conversation. The remainder of Jessica's shift at the warehouse passed slowly, her attention divided between her current responsibilities and anticipation of the evening meeting that would begin her formal return to classified work. She found herself evaluating her decision from multiple angles, questioning whether she was making a smart career move or setting herself up for psychological difficulties that would undo the progress she'd made in civilian life. By the time she left the warehouse, Jessica had reached a tentative peace with her choice. The decision was made, the commitment was given, and second-guessing wouldn't change anything except her ability to perform effectively when the time came. Stone had offered her a week to test whether meaningful work still felt like something she wanted in her life, and the only way to answer that question was to accept the challenge and see what happened. Murphy's coffee shop occupied a converted house near the base, its interior decorated with military memorabilia and photographs that created an atmosphere of informal professionalism. The clientele consisted primarily of off-duty personnel and civilians who worked in defense-related industries, people who understood that some conversations required privacy and discretion even in public settings. Jessica arrived a few minutes early and selected a corner table that provided good sight lines while appearing casual about the choice. It was an automatic response to unfamiliar environments, the kind of tactical thinking that had become second nature during her operational years and had never completely faded despite months of civilian routine. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was easy to identify when he entered the coffee shop. He moved with the controlled bearing of someone accustomed to handling sensitive responsibilities, and his civilian clothes couldn't disguise the military precision in his posture and movement patterns. He was probably in his early 40s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent serious time in serious places, and his eyes showed the kind of situational awareness that came from experience in environments where relaxing your guard could have permanent consequences. "Ms. Martinez," he said as he approached her table, extending his hand for a professional handshake. "Tom Rodriguez. Thank you for making time for this meeting." Jessica shook his hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that suggested Rodriguez had earned his rank through operational experience rather than administrative assignments. There was something reassuring about dealing with people who understood the realities of special operations work, who didn't need lengthy explanations about why certain procedures existed or why security protocols couldn't be compromised for the sake of convenience. Rodriguez placed a sealed envelope on the table between them, then ordered coffee for both of them while they conducted their business. The envelope was unmarked except for a classification stamp that indicated its contents required specific clearances to access, and Jessica felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility at the prospect of being trusted with sensitive information again. "Before we proceed," Rodriguez said once they were settled with their coffee, "I need to confirm some administrative details. Your security clearances were never formally revoked, just placed in inactive status when you left active duty. Reactivating them for this assignment requires some paperwork, but the process has already been initiated based on Colonel Stone's recommendation." Jessica nodded, understanding that her ability to access classified information was being restored through administrative channels that existed specifically to handle situations where former personnel needed to be brought back into sensitive programs. It was a reminder that leaving the special operations community didn't mean severing all connections to it, that people with her background remained part of an extended network that could be activated when circumstances required their unique capabilities. "What's the scope of my responsibilities for this assignment?" Jessica asked, ready to begin thinking concretely about the challenges she'd be facing. Rodriguez glanced around the coffee shop to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard, then leaned forward slightly to speak in a lower tone. You'll be the primary liaison between the visiting unit and base support services. That means coordinating everything from transportation and accommodation to equipment storage and maintenance. The unit has some very specific requirements that go beyond standard military protocols, and they need someone who understands how to handle sensitive materials without asking questions that don't need answers. Jessica understood that Rodriguez was describing work that would require her to operate at the intersection of official military procedures and the informal networks that handled requirements too sensitive for normal supply chains. It was the kind of coordination that demanded both technical competence and absolute discretion, where success was measured not just by meeting operational requirements, but by maintaining the security protocols that protected ongoing missions. How much advance information will I have about their specific needs? Jessica asked, already thinking about the preparation she'd need to do to perform effectively. The briefing materials in that envelope contain everything you'll need for initial planning, Rodriguez replied, gesturing toward the sealed document. Additional details will be provided during your Sunday evening read-in, after you've had a chance to review the preliminary information and ask any questions about requirements or procedures. Jessica appreciated the structured approach to information sharing, understanding that it was designed to give her time to process complex requirements while maintaining security boundaries that protected information she didn't need to know. It was a level of operational sophistication that reminded her why she'd been attracted to special operations work in the first place. The intellectual challenge of coordinating complex activities under constraints that most people never encountered. Rodriguez finished his coffee and prepared to leave, but paused to offer one final piece of guidance that carried the weight of personal experience rather than official instruction. "Ms. Martinez," he said quietly, "I don't know the details of why you left active duty, and I don't need to know. But I will say that I've seen a lot of good people struggle with the transition to civilian life, and I've also seen some of them find their way back to meaningful work when the right opportunity presented itself. Colonel Stone doesn't make recommendations lightly, and if she thinks you're ready for this assignment, then you probably are." Jessica felt Rodriguez's words settle into the spaces where doubt and anxiety had been building since she'd agreed to take the job. His confidence in Stone's judgment and his recognition of the challenges facing transitioning veterans provided a kind of validation that she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you," Jessica said simply. "I appreciate the support, and I won't let the team down." Rodriguez nodded and stood to leave, but then paused as if remembering something important. "One more thing. The visiting unit has some personnel who've had experiences similar to yours. They understand what it's like to carry certain kinds of weight, and they tend to be pretty good at recognizing people who share that background. Don't be surprised if you find some common ground there." After Rodriguez left, Jessica remained at the coffee shop for several more minutes, staring at the sealed envelope that contained her transition back into classified work. The weight of the document was insignificant, but its implications for her immediate future felt enormous. Opening it would begin a process that couldn't be reversed, a return to responsibilities and constraints that she'd spent months trying to escape. Finally, Jessica picked up the envelope and walked to her truck, placing it carefully on the passenger seat where it would remind her of the commitment she'd made and the preparation she needed to complete before Sunday evening. The drive back to her motel gave her time to think about Rodriguez's words and what they suggested about the people she'd be working with during the coming week. The possibility of finding common ground with people who understood her background was both appealing and anxiety-provoking. On one hand, it would be a relief to work with personnel who didn't need explanations about security, protocols, or justifications for procedures that might seem excessive to civilians. On the other hand, it meant the possibility of forming connections that could make it harder to maintain the emotional distance she'd been cultivating as protection against future losses. Back in her motel room, Jessica spread the contents of Rodriguez's envelope across the small table that served as her workspace. The materials included organizational charts for the visiting unit, equipment lists that required special handling procedures, and logistical timelines that would govern her activities throughout the week. Reading through the documents, she began to understand the scope and complexity of the coordination work she'd committed to performing. The visiting unit was smaller than she'd expected, but apparently equipped with capabilities that far exceeded their numerical strength. Their equipment requirements included items that didn't appear in standard military inventories, weapons and communications gear that existed in the gray areas between acknowledged military technology and capabilities that couldn't be officially confirmed. Jessica found herself falling back into the systematic approach to complex problems that had defined her operational years, breaking down the overall requirements into manageable components and identifying potential bottlenecks or complications that could impact mission success. It was mental work that engaged capability she hadn't used in months, and she was surprised to discover how much she'd missed the intellectual challenge of high-stakes problem-solving. As she studied the materials, Jessica began to understand why Stone had been so confident that she was the right person for the assignment. The work required someone who could think tactically about logistics while maintaining awareness of security implications. Someone who understood that small mistakes in equipment handling could have consequences far beyond the immediate training exercise. More importantly, it required someone who could be trusted with information that couldn't be shared outside the program. Someone whose discretion and reliability had been tested under conditions where the consequences of poor judgment were measured in lives rather than performance evaluations. Stone had been right that people with her background possessed capabilities that were difficult to replace and impossible to adequately train in classroom settings. Jessica spent the evening reviewing the briefing materials and making preliminary notes about preparation she'd need to complete before beginning the assignment. The work felt familiar in a way that months of civilian employment hadn't, engaging her problem-solving abilities and tactical thinking in ways that reminded her why she'd been attracted to special operations in the first place. By the time she finished her review, Jessica had reached a new level of peace with her decision to accept Stone's offer. The assignment would be challenging and would require her to confront aspects of her past that she'd been avoiding, but it would also give her a chance to use her actual capabilities in service of something that mattered. Looking at the photograph of her fallen teammates that still occupied the place of honor on her nightstand, Jessica felt something shift in the way she understood her survival and its obligations. Maybe Stone had been right that honoring the dead meant continuing the work they'd all believed in together, using the skills they'd helped her develop in service of missions that carried forward their shared commitment to something larger than individual safety or comfort. Jessica carefully secured the briefing materials in her bag and began planning for the week ahead, her mind already engaged with the challenges and opportunities that awaited her return to meaningful work. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without the nagging sense that she was wasting capabilities that had been developed at too high a price to be casually discarded. Sunday evening couldn't come soon enough. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of humid stillness that made North Carolina summers feel like living inside a wet blanket. Jessica drove through the Fort Riverside gates with a sense of anticipation that reminded her of pre-mission briefings and facilities that didn't appear on organizational charts, where the success of operations depended on everyone involved executing their responsibilities with absolute precision. The base looked different at night, its familiar daytime bustle replaced by the controlled activity of evening operations and security patrols. Floodlights illuminated key facilities while leaving others in strategic darkness, creating patterns of light and shadow that spoke to the kind of operational security measures that most civilians never noticed, but that people with Jessica's background read like a tactical manual. Colonel Stone was waiting for her at the secure briefing facility, a nondescript building that housed the kind of conference rooms where Sensitive information was shared with people who possessed both the clearances to access it and the judgment to protect it. Stone's presence at the evening briefing suggested that this assignment carried more significance than a simple logistics coordination job, though Jessica suspected she wouldn't fully understand the implications until she was deeper into the program. Ms. Martinez, Stone greeted her with professional warmth as Jessica entered the briefing room. "Thank you for making this commitment on such short notice. I think you're going to find this week more interesting than anything you've encountered in civilian employment." The briefing room contained the standard features of spaces designed for classified discussions: secure communications equipment, white noise generators to prevent electronic eavesdropping, and seating arrangements that ensured everyone present had appropriate clearances for whatever information would be shared. Jessica felt the familiar weight of returning to an environment where every detail was governed by security protocols developed through decades of operational experience. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was present along with two other personnel Jessica didn't recognize, both wearing civilian clothes that couldn't disguise their military bearing. Stone made brief introductions that provided names and general responsibilities without revealing specific unit affiliations or operational histories, the kind of professional courtesy that allowed people to work together effectively while maintaining appropriate operational security boundaries. "Before we begin the detailed briefing," Stone said as everyone settled into their seats, "I want to provide some context for why this assignment exists and why we specifically requested someone with your background to handle the coordination requirements." Jessica listened carefully as Stone outlined the nature of the visiting unit and their training objectives. The team was conducting advanced urban warfare exercises that would test their capabilities in scenarios designed to replicate the most challenging operational environments they might encounter in real-world deployments. Their equipment and procedures had been developed through years of classified research and operational refinement, creating capabilities that existed at the cutting edge of special operations technology. "The challenge we face," Stone continued, "is that their support requirements go well beyond what our standard logistics personnel are equipped to handle. They need someone who understands that certain equipment doesn't get logged in normal inventory systems, that some procedures exist for reasons that can't be explained in training manuals, and that operational security isn't just a bureaucratic requirement but a matter of protecting ongoing missions and the people who execute them." Jessica nodded her understanding, recognizing the kind of work that required someone who could operate effectively in the gray areas between official military procedures and the informal networks that handled requirements too sensitive for normal supply chains. It was coordination work that demanded both technical competence and absolute discretion, where success was measured not just by meeting operational requirements, but by maintaining the security protocols that protected capabilities from compromise. Rodriguez distributed additional briefing materials that contained detailed equipment lists and handling procedures, documents marked with classification levels that required Jessica to sign acknowledgement forms confirming her understanding of the security responsibilities she was accepting. The paperwork was familiar from her operational years, but signing it again after months of civilian employment felt like crossing a threshold back into a world she'd thought she'd left permanently. "Your primary point of contact will be the unit's senior enlisted advisor," Stone explained, gesturing toward one of the personnel Jessica hadn't been introduced to earlier. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chun has been with this unit for 8 years and has more operational experience than most people accumulate in entire careers. She'll be able to provide guidance on any questions that arise during the exercise." Jessica felt a jolt of recognition at the name, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as her mind raced through possibilities. Chun was not an uncommon surname, and the coincidence of meeting another Sarah Chun might be exactly that, a coincidence. But something in Stone's tone suggested there might be more to the introduction than simple administrative necessity. Master Chief Chun stepped forward with the controlled bearing of someone accustomed to handling complex responsibilities under pressure. She was probably in her late 30s, with the kind of composed professionalism that came from years of operational experience in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. Her civilian clothes couldn't disguise the physical conditioning that suggested ongoing involvement in activities that required peak fitness, and her eyes held the kind of situational awareness that never fully switched off even in supposedly secure environments. "Ms. Martinez," Chun said as she extended her hand for a professional handshake, "I understand you have experience with logistics coordination in sensitive environments. That's exactly what we need for this exercise. Someone who can anticipate problems before they develop and solve them without creating additional complications." Jessica shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that suggested Chun had earned her rank through hands-on experience rather than administrative assignments. There was something in Chun's tone that suggested recognition, though Jessica couldn't immediately place where they might have encountered each other previously. "I'm looking forward to working with your team," Jessica replied. "From what I've seen in the briefing materials, this should be an interesting challenge." Chun's smile suggested she understood exactly what kind of interesting Jessica was referring to. "It will definitely be that. We tend to push equipment and procedures to their limits during these exercises, which means our support requirements can get pretty specific pretty quickly. Having someone who understands our operational mindset will make everything run much more smoothly." The remainder of the briefing covered logistical details and administrative procedures, the kind of systematic preparation that ensured everyone understood their responsibilities and the standards by which their performance would be evaluated. Jessica found herself falling back into the familiar rhythm of operational planning, asking detailed questions about timelines and contingencies, while taking notes that would guide her preparation for the week ahead. As the briefing concluded, Stone pulled Jessica aside for a brief private conversation that carried the weight of final guidance before beginning a complex assignment. "Ms. Martinez," Stone said quietly, "I want you to know that this unit specifically requested you after I described your background and capabilities. They've worked with a lot of support personnel over the years, and they know the difference between someone who follows procedures and someone who understands why the procedures exist. You're going to find that they treat competent support people as valued team members rather than just service providers." Jessica felt something settle in her chest at Stone's words, a recognition that she was joining people who understood the importance of everyone involved in an operation, regardless of their specific role or rank. It was the kind of professional respect she'd missed during her months of civilian employment, where her capabilities were underutilized and her experience was irrelevant to the simple tasks she'd been assigned. "Colonel," Jessica said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate this opportunity. It's been a long time since anyone trusted me with work that actually mattered, and I won't take that trust lightly." Stone's expression showed understanding for the challenges Jessica had faced in transitioning to civilian employment and the personal significance of returning to meaningful work. "Ms. Martinez, people with your background deserve to use their capabilities in service of something important. This assignment will give you a chance to see whether you still want that kind of responsibility in your life." Jessica left the briefing facility with a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her discharge from active duty. The assignment would be challenging and would require her to perform at levels she hadn't maintained during her months of civilian routine, but it would also give her a chance to prove to herself that she could still handle the kind of high-stakes coordination work that had once defined her professional identity. The week that followed exceeded every expectation Jessica had formed during her preparation. Master Chief Chun's unit operated with the kind of seamless professionalism that came from years of working together in environments where individual Competence and team cohesion were matters of survival rather than performance evaluation metrics. Their equipment requirements were indeed complex and sensitive, requiring Jessica to coordinate with suppliers and maintenance personnel, who understood that certain questions didn't have answers that could be shared outside specific clearance levels. Jessica found herself drawing on capabilities she hadn't used in months, thinking tactically about logistics while maintaining awareness of security implications that could impact operations far beyond the immediate training exercise. The intellectual challenge was exactly what she'd been missing in civilian employment, work that engaged her problem-solving abilities and tactical thinking in ways that reminded her why she'd been attracted to special operations in the first place. More importantly, she discovered that her concerns about psychological readiness had been largely unfounded. Working with people who understood her background and respected her capabilities created an environment where she could focus on professional performance rather than constantly managing the anxiety that had accompanied her civilian employment. Chun's team treated her as a valued colleague rather than just a service provider, including her in planning discussions and seeking her input on decisions that affected logistical coordination. By midweek, Jessica realized that Stone had been right about the relationship between meaningful work and personal fulfillment. The assignment was demanding and required her to maintain standards of performance she hadn't needed to meet in months, but it also provided the kind of professional satisfaction that had been missing from her civilian routine. She was using her actual capabilities in service of something that mattered, working with people who understood both the importance of the mission and the individual contributions that made success possible. The breakthrough moment came on Thursday morning when a critical piece of communications equipment failed during a complex urban warfare scenario. The malfunction threatened to compromise the entire day's training objectives, and standard repair procedures would have required delays that would cascade through the remaining exercise schedule. Jessica found herself automatically thinking through alternative solutions that drew on her operational experience with similar equipment in field environments where standard procedures weren't available. Working with Chun and the unit's technical specialists, Jessica helped develop a field expedient repair procedure that restored full functionality without compromising the exercise timeline. The solution required exactly the kind of tactical thinking and operational flexibility that had defined her military career, and the successful outcome reminded everyone involved why experience with sensitive equipment couldn't be replaced by classroom training or technical manuals. "Outstanding work," Chun told her after the equipment was restored to full operation. "That's exactly the kind of problem-solving we need from our support personnel. You anticipated the implications and developed a solution before the problem could impact our training objectives." Jessica felt a surge of professional satisfaction that she hadn't experienced since her discharge from active duty. The recognition came from people whose opinions she respected, based on performance that utilized her actual capabilities rather than simply meeting minimum requirements for routine tasks. It was validation that she could still handle the kind of high-stakes coordination work that had once been her specialty. That evening, as the exercise concluded for the day, Chun approached Jessica with a more personal conversation that revealed the recognition Jessica had sensed during their initial introduction. "Ms. Martinez," Chun said as they secured the day's equipment for overnight storage, "I think it's time I mentioned that we've actually worked together before, though in a very different context. I was part of the support team for Operation Neptune's Gate about 4 years ago. Your reputation preceded you even then, and watching you work this week has confirmed everything I heard about your capabilities." Jessica felt the pieces click into place as she remembered the operation Shin was referencing, a classified mission that had required coordination between multiple special operations units in an environment where communication challenges had made logistics coordination critical to mission success. Chun had been part of the Naval Special Warfare component that had provided maritime insertion capabilities, and Jessica had been responsible for coordinating the equipment and supply requirements that had enabled the entire operation. I remember. That operation, Jessica replied carefully, understanding that they were discussing classified activities that couldn't be detailed even in their current secure environment. It was a challenging coordination problem, but we had excellent people in all the key positions. Chun's smile suggested she understood exactly what Jessica was referring to, and the professional compliment implicit in her words. It was also a successful mission because everyone involved understood that individual competence and team coordination were equally important. That's something you demonstrated then, and you've demonstrated it again this week. The conversation continued with the kind of professional sharing that was possible between people who had worked together successfully in challenging environments, discussing lessons learned and operational insights without revealing specific details that needed to remain classified. For Jessica, it was the first time in months that she'd been able to discuss her military experience with someone who understood both the technical challenges and the personal costs of special operations. Work. Friday's final exercise scenarios tested the unit's capabilities under the most challenging conditions of the week, requiring Jessica to coordinate complex equipment movements and maintenance procedures while maintaining the security protocols that protected sensitive capabilities from compromise. The day's activities represented the culmination of everything she'd learned about the unit's requirements and procedures, and her performance demonstrated that she'd successfully reintegrated her operational skills with current assignment demands. As the exercise concluded and equipment was secured for return shipment to the unit's home station, Jessica felt a sense of professional accomplishment that reminded her why she'd been attracted to special operations work originally. The week had required her to perform at levels she hadn't maintained during her civilian employment, but it had also provided the kind of intellectual challenge and meaningful responsibility that civilian jobs hadn't offered. Stone arrived for the final debrief with the kind of professional satisfaction that suggested the week had met or exceeded her expectations for both Jessica's performance and the unit's training objectives. The debrief covered administrative details and lessons learned, but also included the kind of frank discussion about future possibilities that Jessica had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Ms. Martinez," Stone said as the formal debrief concluded, "I have a proposition that I hope you'll consider seriously. We have ongoing requirements for coordination support that would utilize exactly the capabilities you've demonstrated this week. It would mean permanent employment with appropriate compensation and benefits, working with units that understand and respect your background." Jessica felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came with major career decisions, particularly decisions that involved returning to work that carried both meaningful responsibilities and potential personal costs. The week had proven that she could still handle the technical and psychological demands of supporting special operations activities, but it had also reminded her of the reasons she'd left that world originally. What would the scope of responsibilities include? Jessica asked, already thinking about the implications of accepting permanent employment that would fully reintegrate her with the special operations community. Stone outlined a position that would involve coordinating support for multiple units, conducting training and operational preparation at Fort Riverside and other facilities, work that would require maintaining security clearances and handling sensitive equipment on a regular basis. The responsibilities would be challenging and meaningful, utilizing her operational experience while providing the kind of professional development opportunities that civilian employment rarely offered. More importantly, the position would connect her with people who understood her background and respected her capabilities, creating a work environment where she could focus on professional performance rather than constantly managing the isolation that had accompanied her civilian employment. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been hoping for without quite admitting it to herself. "I'd like to accept," Jessica said, surprised by how easily the decision came once she'd finally allowed herself to consider it seriously. "This week has reminded me that meaningful work is worth the additional challenges that come with it." Stone's smile showed genuine satisfaction at Jessica's decision. "Outstanding. I'll have the administrative personnel contact you next week with the details about salary, benefits, and start date. Welcome back to the team, Ms. Martinez. I think you're going to find this much more fulfilling than folding uniforms in a supply depot." As Jessica prepared to leave Fort Riverside that evening, she reflected on the week that had transformed her understanding of her own capabilities and career possibilities. The assignment had required her to confront aspects of her military experience that she'd been avoiding, but it had also demonstrated that she could still perform effectively in challenging environments and that meaningful work was worth the personal costs that came with it. Master Chief Chun approached her as she was loading her personal gear into her truck, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Ms. Martinez," Chun said, "I wanted to give you something before you left." It belonged to someone who understood the importance of supporting the people who carry out difficult missions, and I think they would have wanted you to have it. Jessica unwrapped the package to find a small challenge coin, the kind that's special. Operations units created to recognize exceptional service or commemorate significant operations. This one bore the inscription, "Neptune's Gate," along with symbols that represented the different units that had participated in the classified mission they discussed earlier. "This is from the operation we worked together," Chun explained. "Your coordination work was critical to mission success, and everyone involved knew it. I kept this coin as a reminder of what excellent support looks like, and after watching you work this week, I realized you should have it." Jessica felt emotion tighten her throat as she accepted the coin, understanding its significance not just as recognition for past performance, but as validation that her contributions had been valued by people whose opinions mattered to her. It was the kind of acknowledgement she'd needed without realizing it. Confirmation that her military service had made a difference, even when official recognition wasn't possible. "Thank you," Jessica said simply. "This means more than I can express." Chun nodded with the understanding of someone who knew that meaningful recognition sometimes came through informal channels when official acknowledgement wasn't possible. "You earned it then, and you've earned it again this week. I'm glad you're going to be working with us permanently." As Jessica drove away from Fort Riverside that evening, she carried with her a sense of professional renewal that she hadn't experienced since her discharge from active duty. The week had proven that she could still handle the demands of supporting special operations activities, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that meaningful work was still available to her if she was willing to accept the responsibilities that came with it. The challenge coin rested on her dashboard where she could see it, a tangible reminder that her capabilities were valued and her contributions mattered to people whose missions couldn't be publicly acknowledged but whose work protected interests that extended far beyond their individual careers. For the first time in months, Jessica felt that her future held possibilities that would utilize her actual capabilities rather than requiring her to hide them. Looking back at the base in her rearview mirror, Jessica understood that she'd found her way back to meaningful work through the recognition of people who understood both her capabilities and the personal costs of special operations service. The uniform she'd been folding in that supply depot had belonged to someone who shared her background and commitment, leading to connections that had restored both her professional purpose and her confidence in her ability to contribute to missions that mattered. Stone had been right that sometimes the safest thing you could do was get back to doing what you were actually good at, and that staying on the sidelines could become more painful than returning to the game. The week had proven that Jessica's skills and experience remained relevant and valuable, and that the special operations community still had room for people who understood the importance of excellence in every aspect of mission support. As she drove toward her new future, Jessica felt the weight of months of underemployment and professional frustration lifting from her shoulders, replaced by the familiar satisfaction of knowing that her work would matter and that the people she supported understood the importance of what they were trying to accomplish together. The road ahead would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but it would also bring the kind of meaningful work that utilized her capabilities in service of something larger than individual career advancement. For someone who had spent months folding other people's uniforms, while her own gathered dust in storage, the prospect of returning to work that engaged her actual skills felt like a form of redemption that she'd earned through patience and the willingness to take calculated risks when the right opportunity presented itself. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but when she read it, she recognized Stone's direct communication style. "Talk to personnel. You start Monday. Looking forward to working with you permanently." For the first time in months, Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. 6 months later, Jessica Martinez stood in the same supply depot where her transformation had begun. But this time she wore the kind of professional attire that marked her as someone with real authority and responsibility. Her new position as Special Operations Logistics Coordinator had brought her full circle to the place where Colonel Stone had first recognized the capabilities hidden beneath her civilian contractor facade. But everything about her situation had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those long days of folding uniforms and fighting the urge to disappear entirely. The depot buzzed with the controlled activity of a facility that had become central to supporting some of the most sensitive training operations conducted at Fort Riverside. Jessica's office occupied a corner of the building that had been converted into a proper command center, complete with secure communications equipment and classified storage facilities that housed the kind of equipment inventories that existed only in the gray areas between official military procurement and capabilities that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. Private Amy Chun, the young mechanic who had been one of the first to sense that Jessica was more than she appeared, now worked directly under Jessica's supervision as part of a team that handled logistics coordination for visiting special operations units. The transition from basic maintenance duties to supporting classified activities had required extensive background investigation and security clearance processing, but Amy had embraced the additional responsibilities with the enthusiasm of someone who understood she was being trusted with work that mattered. "Ma'am," Amy said as she entered Jessica's office with a tablet containing the morning's coordination requirements. "The advance team from SEAL Team 4 arrives this afternoon, and they're requesting the same equipment configuration we used for the counter-terrorism exercise last month. I've already initiated the procurement process, but they're asking for some modifications to the communications package that might require vendor coordination." Jessica reviewed the requirements on Amy's tablet, automatically thinking through the logistical complexities and potential complications that could impact the training timeline. The work required exactly the kind of tactical thinking and operational awareness that had defined her military career, but now she was applying those capabilities in a supervisory role that allowed her to develop other people while contributing to mission success. "Good initiative on starting the procurement early," Jessica replied, making notes about vendor contacts and delivery schedules. "For the communications modifications, reach out to Rodriguez at the Secure Communications Office. He handled similar requirements for the Army Special Forces exercise 2 weeks ago, and he'll know which vendors can provide what we need without extensive lead times." Amy nodded and made her own notes, but Jessica could see that she wanted to ask something more personal than the immediate logistical questions. Over the months they'd worked together, Amy had gradually learned pieces of Jessica's background through the kind of casual conversations that happen between people who spent significant time coordinating complex activities under pressure. "Ma'am," Amy finally said, "can I ask you something about when you were working as a temp contractor here? I mean, did you know then that you were going to end up in this position, or did it feel like you were just trying to get through each day? Jessica smiled at the question, understanding the real concern underlying Amy's curiosity. The young woman was probably wondering about her own career trajectory and whether the additional responsibilities and security clearances would lead to opportunities that justified the personal sacrifices that came with classified work. Honestly, Jessica replied, when I was folding uniforms in this building, I thought my career in anything meaningful was completely over. I was just trying to earn enough money to pay rent while figuring out what to do with skills that didn't seem to have any civilian applications. I had no idea that Colonel Stone was going to walk in here and change everything. Amy's expression showed the kind of relief that came from hearing that career uncertainty was normal and that meaningful opportunities could emerge from situations that felt like dead ends. It's just that sometimes this work feels like such a big responsibility, and I wonder if I'm really qualified for what we're being asked to do. Jessica understood the imposter syndrome that affected many people when they transitioned from routine military duties to work that required higher clearances and greater discretion. She'd felt the same uncertainty during her first weeks in the current position, wondering whether months of civilian employment had eroded capabilities that had once been second nature. Amy, Jessica said, the fact that you're asking that question tells me you're exactly the kind of person who should be doing this work. People who don't feel the weight of responsibility are the ones you have to worry about. The people who understand that mistakes have consequences beyond their immediate work environment are the ones who maintain the standards that keep everyone safe. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become Jessica's primary liaison for coordination with base operations and visiting unit requirements. His role had evolved along with Jessica's position, creating a partnership that handled the interface between official military procedures and the informal networks that supported sensitive activities. Jessica, Rodriguez said as he entered her office, I just got word that we're going to be hosting a multi-service exercise next month that's going to require some very specific support arrangements. The preliminary briefing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and they specifically requested that you be included in the planning process from the beginning. Jessica felt the familiar surge of professional satisfaction that came with being specifically requested for challenging assignments. Recognition that her capabilities were valued and that her contributions could impact mission success. The evolution from anonymous temp worker to essential team member had happened gradually, but moments like this reminded her how dramatically her professional situation had changed. What's the scope of the exercise? Jessica asked, already thinking about the coordination challenges that multi-service operations typically presented. Rodriguez's expression suggested the exercise would be particularly complex and sensitive. Counter-terrorism scenario involving Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Special Operations. They'll be testing interoperability and coordination protocols that are being developed for deployment in some very challenging operational environments. Jessica nodded her understanding, recognizing the kind of exercise that existed specifically to test capabilities and procedures that couldn't be evaluated through normal training programs. The logistics coordination would require managing equipment and supply requirements for units with different operational cultures and security protocols, creating exactly the kind of complex problem that utilized her background in special operations. Support. I'll be ready for the briefing, Jessica confirmed. Amy, this would be a good learning opportunity for you as well. Multi-service coordination requires understanding how different units approach similar problems, and that's experience you can't get from textbooks or standard training programs. Amy's expression showed excitement mixed with the kind of nervous anticipation that came with being offered opportunities that exceeded your current experience level. I'd appreciate the chance to learn from an exercise like that, ma'am. It sounds Like exactly the kind of challenge that would help me understand how all the different pieces of special operations support fit together. Rodriguez smiled at Amy's enthusiasm, remembering his own early experiences with complex coordination assignments and the learning curve that came with supporting operations that required capabilities beyond standard military procedures. You'll definitely learn a lot, but you'll also discover that the principles are the same regardless of the complexity. Attention to detail, anticipating problems before they develop, and maintaining security protocols even when everything else is changing rapidly. As Rodriguez left to coordinate with other base personnel about the upcoming exercise, Jessica reflected on how much her professional situation had evolved since the day she'd first walked into this depot with nothing more than temporary contractor paperwork and the hope that routine work might provide some stability while she figured out what to do with her life. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Returning to work that required security clearances and operational discretion had meant accepting constraints on what she could discuss with people outside the program, recreating some of the isolation that had contributed to her decision to leave military service originally. But the professional satisfaction and sense of purpose that came with meaningful work had proven to be worth the personal costs, especially when she was working with people who understood both the importance of the mission and the individual contributions that made success possible. More importantly, the position had allowed her to mentor people like Amy, who were beginning their own careers in special operations support, sharing knowledge and experience that couldn't be acquired through formal training programs. Watching Amy develop from a basic mechanic into someone capable of handling sensitive coordination responsibilities reminded Jessica that her own capabilities were valuable not just for their immediate application, but for their contribution to developing the next generation of personnel who would support critical missions. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Stone, who had been promoted to Brigadier General and transferred to a position that involved coordinating special operations activities across multiple installations. Despite her increased responsibilities and geographic distance, Stone maintained regular contact with the personnel and programs she'd helped develop at Fort Riverside. Heard about the multi-service exercise, Stone's message read. Your reputation is spreading beyond this base. Keep up the excellent work. Jessica smiled at the message, understanding that Stone's continued interest represented more than just professional courtesy. The general had taken a calculated risk in offering Jessica the opportunity to return to meaningful work, and her success reflected well on Stone's judgment about personnel and capabilities. More importantly, it validated Stone's belief that people with special operations backgrounds deserved opportunities to use their capabilities in service of something important. The afternoon brought a steady stream of coordination activities and planning discussions that reminded Jessica why she'd been attracted to special operations work originally. Each problem required thinking several steps ahead while maintaining awareness of current requirements, anticipating complications that could cascade through complex timelines, and developing contingency plans that could be implemented without compromising overall mission objectives. Working with Amy on the preparations for SEAL Team 4's arrival, Jessica found herself explaining not just the immediate logistical requirements, but the reasoning behind security protocols and equipment, handling procedures that might seem excessive to people without operational experience. The teaching aspect of her current position provided a different kind of professional satisfaction than her previous roles. The opportunity to share knowledge that had been developed through years of high-stakes experience. The reason we maintain separate storage areas for different types of equipment, Jessica explained as they reviewed security protocols, isn't just bureaucratic procedure. Some of this gear represents capabilities that could be compromised if the wrong people understood how it worked or what it was designed to accomplish. Our job is to ensure that people who need the equipment can access it efficiently while maintaining The security boundaries that protect ongoing operations. Amy nodded with the serious attention of someone who understood that the work carried real consequences beyond immediate performance evaluations. It's like we're part of the mission, even though we're not the ones actually conducting the operations. Our mistakes could impact people who are putting themselves at risk in places we can't even know about. Jessica felt satisfaction at Amy's understanding of the broader implications of their work. Recognition that the young woman was developing the kind of operational mindset that distinguished excellent support personnel from those who simply followed procedures without understanding their purpose. Exactly, Jessica confirmed. That's why this work requires people who can think about the bigger picture while maintaining attention to immediate details. It's not enough to just process equipment requests or schedule transportation. We have to understand how our decisions impact everything else that's happening, including things we don't have clearance to know about specifically. As the day concluded and the depot settled into its evening routine, Jessica remained in her office to complete administrative tasks and review plans for the following week's activities. The work required the kind of systematic attention to detail that had characterized her military career, but now she was applying those capabilities in a leadership role that allowed her to influence how complex operations were supported and executed. Looking around her office at the charts and schedules that tracked multiple concurrent activities involving some of the most capable military units in the world, Jessica reflected on the journey that had brought her from folding uniforms as an anonymous temp worker to coordinating logistics for operations that would influence national security in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The transformation had required accepting that meaningful work came with personal costs and professional responsibilities that couldn't be ignored or delegated to others. But it had also provided the kind of purpose and professional satisfaction that civilian employment had never offered. The opportunity to use her actual capabilities in service of missions that mattered in ways that extended far beyond individual career advancement. Jessica's personal phone rang with a call from her sister, one of the few family members who understood enough about her background to ask meaningful questions about her current work without requiring explanations that would compromise security protocols. "Jess," her sister said, "you sound different lately. More like yourself, if that makes sense. Are you finally doing work that actually uses your brain again?" Jessica smiled at her sister's direct approach to asking about her professional satisfaction, without requesting details that couldn't be shared. "I am, actually. It turns out that hiding from what you're good at doesn't make you any safer. It just makes you miserable in a different way." Her sister's laugh carried relief and satisfaction. "I'm glad you figured that out. Mom was starting to worry that you were going to spend the rest of your career in jobs that a high school student could do with a week of training. She didn't understand why someone with your background was settling for work that didn't challenge you." Jessica understood her family's concern and their relief at her return to meaningful employment, even though they couldn't know the specific details of what her current position involved. The general principle that people should use their capabilities in service of something important was one that didn't require security clearances to understand or appreciate. As she prepared to leave the office that evening, Jessica paused to look at the challenge coin from Operation Neptune's gate that now occupied a place of honor on her desk, alongside commendations from her current position and photographs of the team she'd supported in various training exercises. The coin served as a reminder that her contributions had been valued long before she'd found the confidence to return to challenging work, and that the capabilities she'd developed through years of operational experience remained relevant and important. Walking through the depot that had once been the site of her professional lowest point, Jessica felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the choices she'd made and the direction her career had taken. The work was demanding and would always carry personal costs that most people never encountered, but it also provided the kind of meaning and purpose that justified those costs through contributions to missions that protected interests far larger than individual comfort or convenience. Amy was securing equipment in the storage areas when Jessica passed by on her way to the parking lot, working with the methodical attention to detail that had made her an excellent addition to the coordination team. Watching her work, Jessica understood that her own journey from civilian contractor to special operations coordinator had created opportunities for other people to develop capabilities and take on responsibilities that would influence their entire careers. "Amy," Jessica called out as she headed for the exit, "excellent work today. The exercise next month is going to be challenging, but I think you're ready for that level of responsibility." Amy's smile showed the kind of professional confidence that came from working with people who understood her capabilities and trusted her with meaningful responsibilities. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity to learn from assignments like this. It makes all the additional security requirements and clearance processes worth it when you're contributing to something that really matters." Jessica nodded her agreement and continued toward her vehicle. But Amy's words stayed with her as she drove home through the familiar countryside surrounding Fort Riverside. The young woman had articulated exactly what Jessica had been feeling about her return to special operations support. That meaningful work justified the personal costs and professional constraints that came with it, and that contributing to something important was worth the additional responsibilities and security requirements that most people never encountered. The drive home gave Jessica time to think about the upcoming multi-service exercise and the coordination challenges it would present, but also about the broader trajectory of her career and the choices that had brought her back to work that utilized her actual capabilities. The path hadn't been direct or easy, but it had led to a position where her contributions mattered and where her experience was valued by people whose missions couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but whose work protected interests that extended far beyond their individual careers. Arriving at the apartment she'd rented after accepting the permanent position with Colonel Stone's program, Jessica felt the satisfaction that came from knowing that tomorrow would bring meaningful challenges and opportunities to contribute to missions that mattered. The work would be demanding and would require maintaining standards of performance that civilian employment had never demanded, but it would also provide the kind of professional fulfillment that came from using her capabilities in service of something larger than immediate financial necessity. For someone who had spent months folding other people's uniforms, while wondering whether her own experience and training would ever be relevant again, the prospect of coordinating logistics for operations that would influence national security represented a form of professional redemption that had been earned through patience and the courage to accept meaningful responsibility when the opportunity finally presented itself. Jessica's reflection was interrupted by a phone call from Master Chief Chun, who was calling from a deployment location that couldn't be identified, but whose operational requirements had been influenced by training exercises that Jessica had helped coordinate at Fort Riverside. "Jessica," Chun said, her voice carrying satisfaction despite the constraints of communicating over unsecured channels, "I wanted you to know that the training we conducted at your facility has proven extremely valuable in our current operational environment. The equipment configurations and procedures we tested are working exactly as planned, and that's largely due to the quality of support coordination you provided." Jessica felt deep satisfaction at Chien's feedback, understanding that her contributions to training exercises were having real-world impact in operational environments where the difference between success and failure was measured in lives rather than performance metrics. It was validation that her work mattered in ways that extended far beyond immediate administrative requirements. "Thank you for letting me know," Jessica replied. "That's exactly the kind of feedback that makes all the coordination challenges worth it. I'm glad the training translated effectively to operational requirements." Chun's call ended with mutual expressions of professional respect and the understanding that their work together would continue through future training exercises and coordination activities that supported ongoing operations in locations that couldn't be discussed over normal Communication channels. As Jessica settled into her evening routine, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from anonymous temp worker to essential member of a team that supported some of the most critical training activities conducted by American Special Operations Forces. The transformation had required accepting that meaningful work came with constraints and responsibilities that most people never encountered, but it had also provided the kind of purpose and professional satisfaction that justified those costs through contributions to missions that protected interests far larger than individual career advancement. Looking at the photographs and commendations that decorated her living space, Jessica understood that her return to special operations support represented more than just career advancement or financial improvement. It represented the recognition that people with her background deserved opportunities to use their capabilities in service of something important, and that the skills developed through years of operational experience remained valuable and relevant even after transitions that might seem to mark the end of meaningful military contribution. The challenge coin from Operation Neptune's Gate rested on her coffee table where she could see it every morning, a reminder that her contributions had been valued long before she'd found the confidence to return to challenging work, and that the respect of people whose missions mattered was worth more than the safety and predictability of civilian employment that underutilized her actual capabilities. For the first time since her discharge from active duty, Jessica felt that her future held unlimited possibilities for meaningful contribution and professional growth, working with people who understood both the importance of the mission and the individual capabilities that made success possible in the most challenging operational environments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.